She's my boss, everyone says it's impossible. But when she leaned in close and whispered, people will notice, I just smiled and said, let them wonder. It was my first week at the new office, and I was still finding my rhythm, the hum of computers, the quiet shuffle of papers, and the low murmur of coworkers felt almost overwhelming. That's when I first saw her. She moved through the office with effortless poise, the kind of grace that made heads turn even if she didn't intend it. Her hair, streaked subtly with silver, caught the morning light as she passed by my desk. I could smell the faint, comforting hint of her perfume, warm, slightly floral, like a memory of rain on sun-warmed stone. And then she looked at me. Just for a second, but enough to make me feel as if I'd been seen, really seen, in a way I wasn't used to. Good morning, she said, her voice calm and inviting, the kind of voice that could quiet a room without raising it. She extended her hand with a light, confident touch. When I shook it, I felt an unexpected steadiness, as if her presence itself was grounding me. Over the next few days, our interactions were professional, precise, but there was something else, an undercurrent of attention that lingered in the corners of every conversation. When she leaned over my shoulder to review a document, I noticed the warmth radiating from her proximity, the gentle brush of her fingers against mine as she pointed out a detail. My heart skipped, not from fear, but from something softer, curiosity, admiration, and an unspoken intrigue I hadn't anticipated. I tried to keep my focus on work, but the way she moved through the office, the subtle gestures, the occasional tilt of her head when she laughed quietly at my awkward jokes, drew my attention constantly. Her confidence was magnetic, but beneath it, I sensed a quiet vulnerability, the faintest flicker of something she didn't reveal to anyone else. It made her human, approachable, yet infinitely fascinating. Even now, I replay the moment she first handed me a file, our fingers brushing just slightly, a touch so brief it could have been accidental, but not to me. I felt a spark of connection, a flicker of recognition, as if we had both noticed something that words could never fully capture. By the end of the week, I realized I was no longer just navigating a new job. I was navigating the subtle currents of something far more complicated, far more thrilling, the quiet, unspoken pull toward my boss, a woman who carried herself with authority, warmth, and a grace that made the world around her feel sharper, brighter, and more electric than I had expected. It started with a coffee break, nothing extraordinary, but the quiet moments in the office often carried the weight of unspoken connections. I found myself standing near the kitchenette, fumbling with the coffee machine, when she appeared behind me, holding her own cup. The air seemed to shift, the soft click of her heels against the tile felt louder somehow, a gentle punctuation in the stillness. "Need help?" she asked, her voice light, playful, but steady. I laughed nervously, realizing my hands were shaking slightly. She smiled, not condescending, but warm and understanding, as if she knew the turmoil of first impressions all too well. When she leaned forward to point at the machine's buttons, our hands brushed lightly. The touch was fleeting, almost accidental, yet it sent an unmistakable jolt through me. I felt my pulse quicken, a mix of surprise and an inexplicable thrill. We ended up leaning against the counter, coffee in hand, talking quietly about trivial things, favorite books, music, weekend routines. Yet, beneath the ordinary words, there was an extraordinary awareness of each other. Her gaze lingered just long enough to make me aware of how she seemed to notice everything about me, the way I fidgeted with the cup, the hesitation in my words, the subtle glances I tried to hide. I felt seen in a way that was both flattering and unnerving. At one point, we reached for the same coffee stirrer. Our fingers collided, a simple touch that might have seemed meaningless to anyone else, but to me it was electric. I felt warmth, a brush of skin that lingered slightly longer than necessary. She looked up at me, her eyes holding a quiet curiosity, an invitation to explore something unspoken. I caught myself smiling, realizing that I wanted that moment to stretch just a little longer. Later, during a team meeting, our eyes met across the room. A small, private acknowledgement passed between us, a subtle, shared understanding that we were both aware of the growing tension. I noticed the way she shifted in her chair, the grace of her posture, the faint warmth in her expression whenever our gaze connected. My mind, usually occupied with reports and deadlines, wandered to the soft timbre of her laughter and the light scent of her perfume that seemed to follow her even across the conference room. By the end of the day, I was caught in a strange, exhilarating limbo, part admiration, part longing, part nervous excitement. It wasn't just a crush, not yet. It was the gentle collision of two lives, separate, distant, and yet undeniably drawn toward each other. A connection that could not be explained by words alone, and a curiosity that made me wonder how far this unspoken tension could reach before it became something more. It was late in the office, the quiet kind of late where the hum of computers and the occasional shuffle of papers felt almost like background music to the city lights spilling through the windows. Most of my colleagues had gone home, leaving only the two of us in the soft, amber glow of desk lamps. The air felt different when she was near, warmer, heavier, charged with a subtle energy I could feel but couldn't yet name. We were bent over a report, her eyes scanning the figures with the same precision she always carried, yet there was a gentleness in her movements that made the task feel less like work and more like a shared secret. She leaned over my shoulder, her hair brushing the side of my face. The scent of her perfume, a delicate mix of jasmine and warmth, lingered in my senses. I felt a small flutter in my chest as her arm hovered close to mine, her hand pointing to a detail in the spreadsheet. When our fingers touched, it wasn't accidental, not entirely. The contact lingered just a heartbeat too long, enough to make me conscious of the warmth and weight of her presence. Her voice, soft and steady, guided me through the corrections. Every time she spoke, I found myself listening more for the cadence and the subtle tremor in her tone than the words themselves. She noticed the hesitation in my responses, the way I sometimes fumbled over details I usually had memorized. And instead of correcting me brusquely, she leaned a little closer, her shoulder brushing mine lightly, an almost imperceptible pressure that felt grounding, reassuring, and yet stirring in a way I wasn't prepared for. At one point, I looked up at her, and our eyes met. She didn't look away, and for a brief moment, time seemed to pause. There was curiosity there, yes, but also something quieter, an acknowledgement of the tension building between us. My throat felt dry, my thoughts scattered, yet there was a strange comfort in that gaze. It was the first time I truly sensed that she, too, was aware of the space between us, aware of how the simplest gestures carried weight. When she finally stepped back, the room seemed emptier, colder in contrast to the warmth she left lingering. My fingers tingled where hers had brushed mine. I realized that what I was feeling wasn't just admiration or curiosity, it was something deeper, something tethered to the quiet intimacy of shared proximity. By the end of that evening, I understood one thing clearly: the connection between us had shifted. It was no longer just professional attention or casual intrigue. It was the first spark of something far more potent, a silent understanding that drew us closer even in moments of stillness, where the smallest touch or glance carried the weight of unspoken possibility. It happened during one of those rare moments when the office felt suspended between work and the world outside. Papers shuffled, keyboards clicked, and the hum of the air conditioning provided a soft rhythm that made every other sound, every small movement, feel more pronounced. We were reviewing a project together, side by side at her desk, the city lights through the large window casting a warm, amber glow across her features. I was leaning over a document, explaining a minor adjustment, when her hand brushed mine, not deliberately, or at least that's what I told myself. The brush lingered, subtle enough to seem accidental, yet it carried a weight that sent an unfamiliar warmth through me. She glanced up, eyes meeting mine with a spark that made the air between us feel heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't yet define. "People will notice," she said suddenly, almost in passing, her tone light but carrying a quiet, knowing edge. My chest tightened slightly at the words. Not because I cared what anyone else thought, but because her voice held that subtle challenge, a recognition of the tension neither of us had spoken aloud. It was a statement that teased boundaries without crossing them, a whisper of awareness that made my pulse accelerate in ways I wasn't prepared to explain. I looked up at her, letting a slow smile curl across my lips. "Let them wonder," I replied softly, confident yet careful, my voice steady even as my heart raced. The words hung between us, a playful defiance that was both private and intimate, as though we'd carved out a space where only we existed. Her gaze lingered, holding mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I felt the quiet thrill of being understood, of being seen in a way that didn't require explanation. The subtle warmth of her proximity pressed against my awareness, the faint scent of her perfume, the gentle brush of her sleeve against my arm, the soft timbre of her laugh when she caught my expression. Every detail amplified the tension, the unspoken promise of something neither of us yet dared to name. I realized, in that moment, that our connection was no longer just about fleeting touches or casual glances. It had transformed into something more, a quiet, deliberate game of awareness and restraint, a slow-burning dance that left us both on the edge of possibility. The office around us faded slightly, irrelevant to the charged intimacy of the space we had carved between ourselves. By the end of that evening, I understood the stakes had shifted. The playful challenge had ignited something deeper, a mutual recognition of attraction and curiosity that neither of us could ignore. And though the world might notice, for now, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the quiet, unspoken bond that had begun to take shape, fragile yet undeniable. It was raining softly when she invited me to walk with her to catch a cab, the droplets pattering against the city streets like a quiet percussion that made the world feel smaller, more intimate. We shared a large umbrella, walking shoulder to shoulder, the space between us both comfortable and electric. The warmth of her presence seeped into me, a subtle reminder of everything I'd felt since the first day I noticed her. She spoke softly, her words measured, yet carrying a weight I hadn't expected. She talked about the pressures of her career, the loneliness that sometimes accompanied authority, the sacrifices she had made over the years to reach the position she now held. Her voice carried vulnerability beneath its confident exterior, a quiet admission that she trusted me enough to let down her guard, even just a little. I listened, captivated not only by the honesty in her tone but by the rhythm of her words, the way her eyes occasionally flicked to mine as if seeking reassurance. As we walked, our hands brushed occasionally, lingering longer than necessary. Each touch was a silent conversation, a testament to the intimacy growing between us. When the rain intensified, I instinctively moved closer, offering the warmth of my coat over her shoulders. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned slightly into me, her head tilting in a subtle gesture of trust. The soft rustle of fabric, the faint scent of rain mixed with her perfume, and the quiet sound of our footsteps on wet pavement combined into a moment that felt suspended in time. We paused under a streetlight while waiting for the cab, and for the first time, our conversation drifted from professional matters to personal thoughts, hopes, regrets, and the small, unspoken things that shape who we are. I noticed the way her fingers brushed mine as she gestured, the warmth of her hand a grounding force, and the way her eyes softened when she looked at me. It was a small, perfect moment, yet it carried a depth I couldn't ignore. I realized then that what had begun as curiosity and admiration had evolved into something more profound, a connection built not only on attraction but on trust, understanding, and shared vulnerability. I felt her heart close enough to mine to hear its quiet rhythm, steady and human, and I sensed she felt the same. By the time the cab arrived, I knew something fundamental had shifted. We were no longer merely boss and employee, colleague and subordinate. We were two people who had glimpsed each other's truths, who had shared a space of honesty and intimacy that no one else could enter. And in that shared space, the slow, steady pull between us grew undeniable, a tension neither of us could yet name, but both felt in the quiet warmth of a rainy night. It was during the office party, a rare moment when the usual rhythm of deadlines and meetings gave way to soft music, scattered laughter, and the warm glow of pendant lights. Most of the team was mingling, yet somehow she and I found ourselves gravitating to the quieter corner by the window, away from the casual chatter, the clinking glasses, and the hum of small talk. The city outside twinkled like scattered gems, reflecting off her eyes in a way that made my chest tighten. She handed me a glass of wine, our fingers brushing as I took it. That fleeting contact, so brief, yet deliberate enough to feel intentional, sent a familiar shiver up my spine. I noticed the subtle shift in her posture, the way she leaned slightly toward me while laughing at something I said, the warmth radiating from her presence in the cool, ambient room. Every detail seemed heightened, as though the world outside this bubble had slowed, leaving only us suspended in a delicate, tension-filled moment. Our conversation drifted effortlessly between casual topics and quiet confessions. I found myself watching her gestures, the way her fingers traced the rim of her glass, the way her eyes lingered on mine just long enough to make me aware of the unspoken language developing between us. At one point, I reached to adjust the napkin near her hand, and our fingers brushed again. She didn't pull away, instead, she allowed it, just a fraction longer than necessity, leaning subtly into the moment. I could feel the magnetic pull between us growing, unspoken but undeniable. Every glance, every touch, every pause in conversation carried more weight than the words we exchanged. The room, the music, the laughter, it all blurred into a backdrop for the quiet, charged intimacy that existed solely between us. I felt my pulse quicken as I realized how acutely aware she was of the same tension, the same hesitation, the same desire restrained by circumstance. There was a long pause, a breath held in shared awareness. I wanted to speak, to acknowledge the invisible thread connecting us, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I let my hand rest lightly near hers, feeling the warmth and subtle tremor in her fingers. She glanced down at the proximity, then back at me, and a small, private smile curled across her lips. By the end of the evening, the tension had reached its peak, not explosive, not spoken aloud, but dense and magnetic, suspended in the delicate balance between what we were allowed to feel and what we longed to express. In that quiet, intimate bubble, we both understood something fundamental: we could no longer deny the depth of our connection. And yet, there was patience, a slow-burning promise that what was meant to unfold would do so on its own terms, in its own time. It was a quiet morning, the kind that felt suspended in time. The city was just beginning to stir, a soft golden light spilling through the cafe windows and casting long, gentle shadows across the tables. We had chosen a corner table, tucked away from the world, where the hum of conversation and the clatter of dishes seemed distant, almost irrelevant. For the first time, there was no pretense, no pressure, only the simple, unspoken understanding that we belonged in this moment together. She arrived first, as always, and I felt the familiar pull in my chest as our eyes met across the room. She smiled, the kind of smile that was both confident and tender, a reflection of the woman I had come to admire and quietly desire. When I slid into the seat across from her, the warmth of her presence seemed to fill the space, making the morning air feel brighter, softer, and somehow more intimate. We talked casually at first, about coffee blends, weekend plans, and the small observations of life that usually go unnoticed. But even in the mundane, there was a richness to the interaction that went beyond words. Every glance, every gesture carried weight, the way her fingers brushed mine when reaching for a cup, the gentle tilt of her head as she listened intently, the subtle warmth in her voice that made even ordinary sentences feel profound. At one point, our hands met deliberately across the table. I felt the steady warmth of her skin, the soft pressure of her palm against mine, and the quiet reassurance that she was present, fully, entirely. She rested her head briefly on my shoulder, not out of necessity but as a choice, a gesture of trust and comfort. I felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, and in that simple act, the weeks of tension, longing, and emotional intimacy culminated in a sense of quiet completeness. The world outside continued its busy rhythm, but within our corner, time slowed. We didn't need words to define the depth of our connection, it was in the lingering touches, the soft smiles, the comfortable silences that spoke volumes. There was no rush, no dramatic confessions, only a steady, warm understanding that had been built slowly, carefully, and deliberately. By the time we left the cafe, there was a new ease between us. Hands brushed intentionally as we walked, shoulders occasionally touching, our steps falling into a shared rhythm. The slow burn attraction, the subtle tension, and the deep emotional intimacy had finally found their resolution. And though the world might notice, it didn't matter, we were content in the quiet strength of what we shared, a connection rooted in trust, warmth, and the unspoken promise that this was just the beginning of something enduring. If you enjoyed this slow burn romance and the quiet tension between them, Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about love, longing, and the moments that make our hearts skip a beat. And don't forget to share your thoughts. Would you let them wonder too?